Hello, everybody, and I'm going to talk to you now about why it matters to change the behavior around the inhalers, especially the propellant inhalers, because of the scale of the climate emergency. I'm going to talk about the scale of the climate emergency, why it's a climate and health emergency, and the NHS response to that emergency and how it's looking to reduce the carbon footprint of inhalers. And a little bit about me. So I'm Pippa Heylings, and I've spent over 30 years living and working in East Africa and South America. And I've worked there on issues around climate change and biodiversity. Since 2018, back in the UK, I've also been working with local authorities across the country in terms of incorporating climate change and ecological nature recovery into their planning. So first of all, the scale of the climate problem and why we're calling this an emergency. Well, first of all, it's just to establish that the world is warming. We do have global warming, and human actions are causing that warming. Now, 98% of scientists agree on this fact. And that has finally led to 196 countries in the first ever global agreement of its kind to agree to binding targets to try and reduce carbon emissions to deal with that global warming and keep it below 1.5 degrees. But for 20 years or more, some of the poorest countries that I've been living and working with, and you can see Bangladesh there on the right, some of those countries have been facing climate impacts and living them, such as sea level rise, flooding, hurricanes, typhoons, with greater intensity and frequency every year, which is really damaging their livelihoods. And it's that slowness to react, particularly by the developed nations, that has now meant that the ability for us to keep global warming to within 1.5 degrees is in doubt. And the reason why it's in doubt is because as we've been slow to react, and what's happened is with the icebergs melting, we're starting to see other reactions to that global warming that are beginning to interact. And as they interact, the modeling and predictions are changing because we're seeing a series of tipping points that will create an avalanche, a cascade of unstoppable events across the world, which really constitute an existential threat to civilization, which has been branded now a planetary emergency. And these tipping points are coming from a series of interlinked events. And we know about the icebergs melting, but this is now also about huge swathes of what's called permafrost. So that's frozen solid soils that contain carbon and methane there across huge swathes of countries up in the Northern Hemisphere. And these are now warming up and slowly releasing those carbon and methane gases into the atmosphere. You may have heard also of the terrible dying off of coral reefs in the tropical oceans. And this is again because of the warming of the seas. As they're dying off together with the seagrasses, what we're seeing is they've also been something that's had been storing carbon up until now. And as they're dying, they're releasing those carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And it's not just about icebergs and polar bears anymore. You may have heard about the tropical forest, and especially the Amazon forest, which is called the lungs of the planet, and heard about the destruction and deforestation there. Well, as the deforestation is happening and the soils are becoming exposed from that heavy tree cover, now exposed to that heat, the soils are drying and they're releasing all of that stored carbon into the atmosphere. And let's go closer to home here in the UK, here in Yorkshire, even within the Yorkshire Moors and the Yorkshire Dales, where you have peatland and bogs. Well, peatland and bogs are twice as effective as storing those carbon inside them than trees. But what's happening is they're becoming degraded. They are also releasing that stored carbon into the atmosphere. And this is causing this acceleration of the global warming and these tipping points, which mean we're going to have some devastating consequences. And today, right on the day of the conference, we had the UK Climate Risk Assessment published. And what it says is not only have we been slow to take action to reduce carbon emissions and to stop global warming, but we're also unprepared for dealing with those kind of devastating events I've just mentioned, the climate chaos that they describe. So we will see across the UK more flooding, and that will also be driven by sea level rise around the coastal areas, more frequent and higher intensity of heat waves in the UK over the next few decades. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we're now facing not only a climate, but also a health emergency. And it was in 2019 that the medical community in the UK declared that the climate crisis is a public health emergency and that it will profoundly affect the lives of every child alive today. And yet taking action could be the greatest global health opportunity of the 21st century. So today's UK climate risk assessment confirms that this is a health emergency. It confirms that there are key risks in all of these categories caused by high temperatures, extreme weather events of flooding, sea level rise, changes in indoor and outdoor air quality, vector-borne diseases, poor water quality, and the changes between summer and winter temperatures. And if that wasn't enough, we've been dealing with COVID and we thought that that was unimaginable, unprecedented. But imagine dealing with two hazards at the same time, double hazards. What if we were trying to deal with COVID and the lockdown, the overwhelming of the NHS, social distancing, at the same time as dealing with an extreme weather event like flooding? Well, it happened in January 2020, and this is the description of a case of what happened in Shropshire, when the flood levels rose so high, trapping people in their houses. And Mary, who was one of the people living there, started desperately messaging texts to her neighbours to see how they were. And she heard back from one old lady who had COVID, was confined to bed, and she was isolating. She couldn't get out. So the question was then, did Mary send in her son into a house where there is somebody with COVID to be able to lift them up, carry them out, and get them to an evacuation centre? Those kind of choices. And it also affected the health workers that were in the area that couldn't get out of their houses to go and deal with the COVID patients that were already suffering from workers being off due to COVID and self-isolating. And the gentleman on the left also shows it's not just about the health, but it's also about well-being, both financial and physical and mental well-being. So he'd suffered hugely during lockdown because his bar and restaurant had to be closed down, and he was trying to deal with the financial effects of that. When the flooding came, he had huge damage to the restaurant and bar. The insurers aren't paying up, and he just feels battered. And he knows that there are people in worse economic conditions than him in the areas that are being flooded. And another double hazard is about coping with heat and COVID. So we have a heatwave plan for England that was published a couple of years ago. But this year, And last year, what were being produced were Beat the Heat posters and leaflets about how to cope with heat and COVID-19, how to find cool places and keep yourself cool. And yet we know about the terrible inequality that's being exposed during COVID, when there are families who have little or no access to open air spaces and to green spaces. And what do those heat waves mean in terms of mortality? Well, just looking over the last couple of years, we've had heat waves in 2019 and 2020. And in 2018, the total deaths were 863. In 2019, there was an estimated impact of 892 excess deaths. And there were signs of excess deaths in the 0 to 64-year age group as well, with recommended maximum daily temperatures of 38.7 degrees Celsius. It was in 2020, during the heat wave, that total cumulative all-cause excess mortality was estimated to be 2,556, with 2,244 excess deaths observed in the 65-year-plus group. Now, we saw in that heat wave in August, temperatures reaching 34 degrees Celsius, along with several tropical nights where night temperatures didn't drop below 20 degrees. So 34 degrees has been recorded in the UK during 7 out of the last 10 years, compared to 7 out of the previous 50 years from 1961 to 2010. And just so you can understand what that means, as you can see on the left-hand side with the trigger temperatures shown on the thermometer, it's at 24 degrees that excess deaths first become apparent. It's at 33 degrees that the tarmac on roads begins to melt. And with this, what we're getting is huge traffic disruption as well, because the rail network is becoming overheated, and we're seeing 41.5 degrees and 36.2 degree temperatures recorded on the tube and on the platform. And what does it mean for the NHS, these heat waves? Well, in 2019-20, there were 3,600 instances of overheating reported in NHS England trusts. And it's estimated that up to 90% of hospital wards are at risk of overheating during heat waves. And also, there's been thermal modelling of future overheating risk in care homes, and showing that, again, there will be overheating in most of those care homes. Whereas in terms of flooding, there are over 6,200 health and social care assets that are at risk of flooding, which would also affect ambulance services in the UK. And a final double hazard, double trouble, is the link between air pollution and climate change. So poor air quality is the largest environmental risk to public health in the UK. And the causes of air pollution and climate change are often the same: the burning of fossil fuels, the transport, energy, heating and plastics, and particulate matter, specifically PM1 and PM2.5, which are the causes of chronic respiratory disease, which come from road vehicles and wood-burning stoves. It's important to note that it was this year that, for the first time ever, we had an inquest that found that a young child, a severe asthmatic sufferer, had on her death certificate that air pollution made a material contribution to her death. And that was the fact that she lived near to a large road, travelled along that large road to school every day. So given that scenario, this is why Greta Thunberg, if you've heard of her, who is a teenage climate activist that has been speaking to world leaders for the last few years, said, "I know that most adults think that they need to give us hope. I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want to feel your fear, because the world is on fire. Our house is on fire, and I want you to act as if the house was on fire. So what has the NHS done in response to that cry for an equivalent response to the emergency? Knowing that we have to transform every part of society to stop this global warming and to stop those irreversible tipping points, and to ensure that the health of a child born today is not defined in terms of health and well-being outcomes by a changing climate. And that means every department, in every sector, across the country. Well, the NHS has become the world's first carbon net zero health system. It's responsible for 4 to 5% of the UK's carbon emissions. And it's created, with its long-term plan, targets to become net zero carbon by 2040 and to reach an interim target of 80% reduction of carbon emissions by 2028 to 2032. Now, within those emissions that are around 5% of the UK's emissions as a total, medicines account for 25% of those emissions. And within that 25%, inhalers are responsible for 3 to 4% of the NHS emissions. And that's equivalent, if you think, what does it really mean? It sounds small, but that's equivalent to the total carbon emissions of all the small nations. So as you can see from the diagram there on the bottom right, it's the equivalent of 175 miles of exhaust emissions from one Ventolin inhaler used throughout its lifetime. And that could be cut if there is a change to a different type of inhaler without the propellants. And it's the propellants, which are the greenhouse gas emissions, which are 380 times more dangerous than carbon dioxide. And what would it mean to really change behavior, reduce the number of propellant inhalers? Well, on the left-hand side here, what you can see would be the impact of different actions to reduce carbon footprint. The first one at the top, that little one, being plant a tree. And the bottom one, which is along the bottom there, which would be a huge increase in terms of reducing the carbon footprint, would be the use of the combination of inhalers that have been mentioned in the speech before. So Sentinel project could not just be about partnering to achieve health outcomes, but partnering to achieve health and climate outcomes. And it's not only the gases on use of the inhalers, of the propellant gas inhalers. Many of those inhalers end up in the domestic waste that then go to landfill, and they often have propellant still within, and then that gets released into the atmosphere as well. So what's needed is also to expand the recycling and disposable schemes to stop those going into landfill and to stop those gases being released into the atmosphere. And it's in this way, each of us, each sector, each health carer, with the beat and turn of a single win, we can each have the power to shift and switch the direction and swoop of the whole flock and be the change we need. Thank you.